Hi guys, Deanne here from Canada Abroad, and today we're going to be talking about the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program, also known as Provincial Nominations. So right now, Ontario is the top destination of new immigrants to Canada, and it's definitely one of the most popular provincial nominee programs out there, with most people trying to get a nomination from Ontario. Now, they have many different categories that people can use to try and get these provincial nominations. And some people might qualify for more than one of these categories, or maybe only one, or unfortunately none. So we are going to take you through all of the different categories that exist. And then we're going to go through each of them individually to explain all of the program requirements so you can see if you actually are eligible to use one of these programs to try and get a provincial nomination. So the first category that they have is for those with a job offer from an eligible employer in Ontario. So one of these programs has a specific list of occupations that your job offer has to be in. So it's the in-demand job offer. So if your occupation is not on that in-demand list, then you wouldn't fall into that section. You would fall into the job offer foreign worker stream, depending again if your employer meets all of the eligible criteria and you as the applicant also meet all of the eligible criteria. So stay tuned, and we are going to be getting into more detail about the requirements that the employer and the applicant needs to meet. The next program that Ontario has is the French-speaking skilled worker. So these are for people who are in Express Entry and they meet all of the normal criteria of the federal skilled worker program, but they're also bilingual. So they have a high enough French test result and an English test result. If you're not fluent in both languages, you obviously wouldn't qualify for this. Or if you're only fluent in French but didn't do well enough on an English test, you wouldn't be eligible to be picked through this program. So again, stay tuned, and we are going to be going into detail about this program, the different scores that you would require on both of those language tests to be considered. The next program that Ontario has is the Skilled Trades program. Now, the thing with this that everyone needs to remember is you have to have work experience in Ontario in a specific skilled trade. So if you've never worked in Ontario and you are a skilled trades person, you won't be able to apply under this program. Now, we will go through the list of occupations that fall within this category, and we'll also go through whether you need a job offer or not in just a minute. The next program that Ontario has is probably the most popular. It's the Human Capital Priorities stream. Now, this one is so popular because you do not need to have a job offer in place in order to get a nomination through this program. Now, it is for people who are in the Express Entry system, and then it's kind of broken down into different categories. So there's the international graduates, which is for people who have graduated from an eligible Ontario university with either a master's or a PhD within the last 2 years. Okay, so it's not just I have a PhD or a master's, but you didn't get it in Ontario, you wouldn't be eligible. The next category is more targeted towards tech people. So there's a set list of occupations in the tech industry that they are selecting. And what they do is they pick people who have experience in that occupation. And then from there, they select people based on their comprehensive ranking system score. So in a few minutes, we'll go through those occupations and the scores that they have been selecting most recently, so you can get an idea if you might have an opportunity to be selected through that stream or not. And the last one is just, they have a list of other occupations not in the tech industry that they have been targeting. And again, it's for people in the Express Entry system. So if you're on that list, they can pick you, but then again, they will select people based on their comprehensive ranking system score. So there's two criteria that they are applying to those potential applicants. So now we're going to go through each of these programs in depth so that, again, you can get an idea whether you would actually qualify for these programs or not. The other thing is we're going to go through them because sometimes there's little things on your profile that the system will pick up thinking that you're eligible for these programs, but if you read the guides under the fine print, you might not be eligible. So it's very important to make sure that if you get a letter from Ontario that they're interested in you, so notification of interest, that you make sure you meet all of the criteria of the program that you have been picked under. Otherwise, if you go ahead and submit your full application and you pay that $1,500 Canadian fee, your application would be refused and the money would not be returned to you. So it's very important that you pay attention and make sure you meet all of the criteria before you go ahead and submit a full application. So the first program that we're going to start with is the French-speaking skilled worker category. Now, to be eligible for a provincial nomination through this program, you have to have a valid Express Entry profile, and you have to have met all of the criteria as a federal skilled worker. So if you go into your Express Entry profile, it would tell you if you had met the criteria as a federal skilled worker or not. And as long as it says met, you know you meet that criteria. The next thing is you could also meet the criteria under the Canadian Experience class. So in some cases, you might meet both of these, the federal skilled worker and the Canadian Experience class. But if you only meet the criteria of one and not the other, that's still acceptable. The next thing is you have to have done an approved French language test in all areas, so listening, reading, writing, and speaking. And you have to obtain at least a CLB level 7 or higher. And you have to have done one of the approved English language tests and gotten a CLB level 6 in all sections or higher. So you have to have done a French and an English test and gotten the required levels on both tests to be considered. Okay. The next thing is you have to have the intention to reside in Ontario if you are granted the nomination. You need to prove that you have the required amount of settlement funds for your family size. And you need to have a minimum of a bachelor's degree. So if you have a 3-year diploma, this would not qualify you. On your educational credential assessment that you would have used to create your Express Entry profile, the Canadian equivalency needs to specifically state bachelor's degree or higher. So bachelor's degree plus a second qualification, or if it says master's or PhD, that's fine. But a 3-year diploma or higher will not work. It has to actually say bachelor's degree or, again, a higher qualification for you to meet the criteria. And don't forget, when creating your Express Entry profile, they do ask you which provinces you might be interested in living and working in. So you have to make sure that you either selected all provinces or you specifically ticked off Ontario. And there would be a second question asking if they can share your information with the province of Ontario. You would have had to have said yes to that question as well for them to be able to identify your profile. Now, if they do give you what we call a notification of interest, so this is basically where they are saying, okay, now we're going to select people for this French-speaking skilled worker category, you will get a message in your IRCC secure account, and it will say, we have identified your profile, we are interested in you. You now have X amount of days to submit all of your documentation to us and to pay the required government application fee. Once you've submitted it, we will then process it, make sure that you've met all of the criteria, and if you do, we will then issue you with the provincial nomination. You then will either choose to accept it or decline it. If you accept it, you will be given 600 extra points on your comprehensive ranking system score. As we know, that amount of points is going to lead to an invitation to apply, and then you'll be eligible to submit your permanent residency application. The next program that we are going to be looking at is the job offer, one of the job offer programs, and this is specifically for the in-demand occupations. So this one, it's going to be quite lengthy. So if I do look down, it's just because there's so many occupations that I'm going to need to read, and I want to make sure that I'm giving you exactly what is available right now. Okay, so in order to meet the criteria of this category, there's 3 things we're going to go through. Number 1, the criteria for the job offer itself that's being offered to you. The criteria for you as the applicant, and also the criteria for the employer. Okay, so we're going to start with the criteria for the job offer itself. It does need to be a full-time indeterminate job offer from an employer in Ontario, and it has to be in one of the in-demand occupations. Now, with these in-demand occupations, there's actually two lists now that they have. The first list we go through, you could be offered a position in any one of these occupation codes anywhere in Ontario, okay? The second list that we do, it's specific just to outside of the GTA, so the Greater Toronto Area. So for the first list, the one I'm going to read now, it's for all of Ontario. So NOC 3413, which is nurses aid, orderlies, and patient service associates. Then we have 4412, home support workers and related occupations, but it's excluding housekeepers. Then it's 7441, residential and commercial installers and servicers. Then it's 7511, transport truck drivers. 7521, heavy equipment operators except for crane operators. 7611, construction trade helpers and laborers. 8431, general farm workers. 8432, nursery and greenhouse workers. 8611, harvesting laborers. 9462, industrial butchers, meat cutters, poultry preparers, and related workers. So again, those occupations, the job offer can be anywhere in Ontario. For the next list, it's only outside of the GTA that you could have an offer in one of these occupations. So 9411, machine operators, mineral and metal processing. 9416, metalworking and forging machine operators. 9417, machining tool operators. 9418, other metal products machine operators. 9421, chemical plant machine operators. 9422, plastic processing machine operators. 9437, woodworking machine operators. 9446, industrial sewing machine operators. 9461, process control and machine operators in food, beverage, and associated product processing. 9523, electronics assemblers, fabricators, inspectors, and testers. 9526, mechanical assemblers and inspectors. 9536, industrial painters, coaters, metal finishing process operators. And 9537, other product assemblers, finishers, and inspectors. Okay, now with this, the wage that you are being offered in any of these positions has to be in line with the medium wage level for that position in Ontario. So your employer would be able to go to the job bank, punch in your occupation code, and they would say the low, median, and high wages based on your location. So they need to be paying you at least the median level for that job, okay? The position has to be required for the employer's business. So if it's, a friend of a friend who's offering you this position, just because they know you, but they can't actually prove that it's required right now in their business, it wouldn't be eligible. So they actually have to show that there is a need for it, okay? And the next thing is we're gonna go through the applicant criteria. So you as the applicant, you need to meet the following criteria to be eligible to apply with the job offer, okay? You need to have at least 9 months of full-time equivalent or part-time equivalent of work experience in the occupation that you're being offered the job in. So you have to have at least the 9 months of experience in that occupation, okay? You need to have gained that work experience in the last 3 years. So let's say you're doing the application and you say, okay, well, I've worked for 9 months in this occupation, but it was 5 years ago. Then you wouldn't be eligible. That work experience has to be within the last 3 years, and they count it from the day you actually submit the application to Ontario. So you need to make sure that if you're cutting it close, you submit that application before you run out of time, okay? If the job that you have been offered requires provincial licensing, you would actually have to prove that you have that provincial licensing approved to be eligible to apply with that job offer in this category, okay? You would be required to do an English or a French test and get at least a CLB4 or higher to qualify for this program. You need to have at least a high school diploma equivalent or higher. Okay, so if you don't have at least a high school diploma in your home country or the equivalent, then you would not be eligible. You have to have the intention to live in Ontario, and you need to have the minimum amount of settlement funds required for your family size. Now, we're going to discuss the requirements that the employer themselves have to meet to be eligible to give you this job offer through this category. So they have to have been in active business in Ontario for the last 3 years, okay? They need to have a business premise in Ontario, so they actually have to have a real office operating in the province. The only sort of exception here, if you are getting this job offer, your primary place of employment needs to be in Ontario. So you're expected to be working in Ontario. The only exemption they have for this is truck drivers, because you're obviously going to be taking shipments, containers outside of the province. That's okay. So that's exempted only for the truck drivers applying in this category. The gross revenue for the company, if they're in the Greater Toronto area, needs to have been at least $1 million per year. If it's outside of the Greater Toronto area, it's $500,000 Canadian that needs to be their gross annual revenue, and that's in the most recent tax year. So they would need to provide documents to support this. If they're located in the Greater Toronto area, they also have to have 5 full-time employees, and they would have to, again, provide paperwork to prove this. If they're outside of the Greater Toronto area, then they would only have to show that they have at least 3 full-time employees. Okay, so that was for the job offer occupations in demand stream. So again, you'd have to meet the criteria as the applicant. The employer has to meet all of the required criteria, and the job offer also has to meet the required criteria. Otherwise, if you submitted the application and not all of the criteria was met, they would refuse it and they would keep the application fee. The application fee, if the job offer is in the Greater Toronto area, can be up to $2,000. If it's out of the Greater Toronto area, it would be $1,500 Canadian. The next program that we're looking at is the job offer foreign worker stream. Now, this stream does not require a notification of interest or even an Express Entry profile to be eligible, but this is one of the ones that opens only a few times during the year. So you would have to watch Ontario's news section to see when they're opening. They usually let you know at least 24 hours in advance. You would need to make sure that you have all of the documents required for this application handy, because when they do open for applications, it gets quite busy. You'll probably have to wait in an online queue. Once you get in, you have to submit the application and all of the information within the time frame given. It really fills up, so not everybody who meets all of the criteria is going to be able to submit their application in time. So it might take you a few tries to actually be successful. So just keep that in mind with this stream. Okay. Now, again, we're going to go through, there's 3 criteria. There's the job offer itself, the applicant, what they need to have in terms of their background, and the employer, what requirements they need to meet in order to be eligible to give this job offer. So we'll start with the job offer itself. It needs to be full-time paid and indeterminate. So part-time won't work, or if it's a 1-year contract and then it's over, that's not going to work either. It has to be indeterminate. The job has to be in skill type O, A, or B, so anything in C or D would not qualify. The wage being offered to you has to be at least at the median level for your occupation code. So you or your employer can go through to the job bank and identify your occupation and just go to Wage Outlook. It will then let you know what the low, median, and high wage is for that profession in your specific area. So they have to be paying you at least the median wage required, or else you would not be eligible to accept this job offer. The position must be necessary for the employer's business. So again, they couldn't be making this position available just because you're a friend of a friend and they're doing you a favor. They have to prove that this is necessary for the business and they need this position to be filled. So it's not sort of redundant, okay? Your primary place of work needs to be in Ontario. Again, they kind of make the exemption for truckers. If you're going to be driving out of the province, that would be acceptable, but only for that type of occupation. Otherwise, you have to be working primarily in Ontario. Now, this one is a new one. So you have to be able to show that either your family member or you do not hold at least 10% equity in the business that's offering you the job offer. So that's, again, probably just making sure it's a legitimate job offer and it's not being offered just because it's your family and they're trying to get you into Canada. So they will look at that as well. Now we're going to look at what the applicant needs themselves in order to apply through this stream. You have to have at least 2 years of full-time paid work experience in the occupation that you're being offered a job in. So if you don't have any related work experience, you would not be able to accept this job offer. Now, this 2 years of work experience, it has to be within the last 5 years. So a lot of the times they look at the last 10 years, but for this specific program, they want to see that that 2 years of related work experience was completed within 5 years of you submitting your application to Ontario, okay? Or you have to have a license or authorization to work in the job that you've been offered. So you can have one or the other, either the 2 years and the 5 years of work experience or that license to work in the profession in Ontario, okay? If the job that you're being offered does require licensing, it's mandatory that you have that in any case in order to apply through this program. And you need to have the intention to live and work in Ontario, okay? Now, if we look at what the employer requirements are, they need to have been an active business in Ontario for the last 3 years. They have to have a premise in Ontario where you are going to be working, so an actual operating office. They need to prove, if they're in the Greater Toronto Area, that their gross annual revenue in the last year, so they'll go with the most recent tax year, was at least $1 million Canadian. If they're outside of the Greater Toronto Area, it needs to be $500,000 or more. If they're located in the Greater Toronto Area, they have to prove that they have at least 5 full-time staff members. If they're outside of the Greater Toronto Area, they have to have at least 3 full-time staff members, okay? And the last thing that they need to show is that they have carried out the required recruitment efforts to prove that they could not find a Canadian to fill the position, and that's why they are trying to now bring you in through this program. Now, typically with these advertisements, they do change, but typically you have to advertise for at least 2 weeks. There's going to be certain sites that they're going to have to post this job on. It's going to have to include, the job title, the salary, the location, education required, any skills and knowledge required, and all of the employer's details. So if you've met all of the other criteria, but they haven't yet advertised this job, you wouldn't be eligible yet to apply through this program. So you would have to make sure that the advertising has been done. And with this application as well, you will have to pay the government application fees. If it's in the Greater Toronto Area, it would be $2,000. If it's out of the Greater Toronto Area, it would be $1,500. The next program we're looking at is the job offer for the international student stream. Now, with this stream, you don't need a notification of interest in order to submit your application, but this is one of the ones where it's not open all year round. You would have to be, again, monitoring the Ontario news section to see when it is going to be opening, and make sure that you have all of the documents available so that when it does open, you can submit all of your documentation within the allotted time. Sometimes it's only a few hours, so you just want to make sure that you have everything ready to submit. Now, again, we're going to go through the 3 different requirements: the job offer itself, what it has to meet, the applicant, what they need to meet, and then the employer, what they need to meet in terms of their business. So the job offer itself, it does have to be full-time and paid and indeterminate. So it couldn't be part-time or volunteer, and it has to be indeterminate, so ongoing, okay? It has to be in a skill level O, A, or B occupation, so any job in a C or D occupation is not going to qualify you here. The wage being offered for this one, it can be at the low end of the average for your province. So what your employer needs to do is they can go to the job bank, look up the occupation that they are offering you the job in and do a wage outlook report. It'll say by area what the low, median, and high wage for this position is. And as long as they are paying you in line with the low spectrum, then it's fine. Okay, and this is, again, the low is only for the student, okay, not for the in-demand occupations or any of the other job offers, just for this one specifically. The position being offered has to be necessary for the business. So again, it couldn't be just created to do a favor to you. They actually have to show that it is required for their business to operate. And your work must take primarily in Ontario. So if you were going to be constantly out of the province, it wouldn't meet the criteria. Your main place of employment and where the work is taking place has to be in Ontario. Now, you as the applicant, you would need to show that you have a completed degree or diploma at an eligible Canadian institution. And you had to have completed that within the last 2 years of the time that you're submitting this application. So again, it's counted from the day you submit this application to Ontario. Now, if you did this on a full-time basis, so if it was part-time, it would take you 2 years to complete. If you did it on a full-time basis, it would have only taken 1 year to complete. So depending on how many courses you were taking, you would just want to see if you had to do it within 2 or 1 years to meet the criteria. If the job that you're being offered requires mandatory licensing to work in the province, you would have to show that you have that licensing completed and available. You have to have the intention to live in Ontario. And you have to submit your application to Ontario within 2 years of your degree or diploma being issued. So the date listed on your degree or diploma that was printed, you're going to count 2 years back from that day and make sure you're submitting the application within that 2-year period. Now, for the employer, the first requirement is they would have to be able to show that basically they're not a family member. So with the job offer you're getting, the company itself cannot be owned partially by a family member. But with this, they get very specific. So no family member or yourself can own 10% equity or more in the business. If it's under 10%, it's acceptable, but not 10% or more, okay? They have to have been an active business for at least 3 years in Ontario. If they are operating in the Greater Toronto Area, they have to show that their latest gross annual revenue, and they'll use the most recent tax year for this, was at least $1 million Canadian. If they're outside of the Greater Toronto Area, they would have to show that it's at least $500,000 Canadian or higher. Now, in terms of the number of employees they have to have, if they're located in the Greater Toronto Area, they need to show they have at least 5 full-time paid staff members. If it's outside of the Greater Toronto Area, it needs to be at least 3 full-time staff members. The next program we're going to be discussing is the Skilled Trades Program. The first thing is you have to have a valid Express Entry profile, and you have to have met the criteria under the Canadian Experience class. So in order to qualify under that class, you have to have at least 1 year of full-time paid work experience in Canada in the last 3 years. So if you never worked in Canada, you would not be eligible then under this specific provincial program. So that's really important to note. Just because you qualify as maybe a federal skilled trades person, it doesn't mean you're going to meet the criteria under this Ontario Skilled Trades Program. You have to meet the criteria as a Canadian Experience Class member. Okay. You need to have worked in one of the identified skilled trades. So they want to see that you have at least 1 year of cumulative paid full-time work experience. So that means that, it doesn't have to be consecutive all 12 months in a row. If you add up the months together, it comes to 12, that's fine. And they want to see that it was in what they call minor group 633. So your occupation code, the first 3 digits would be 633, or in major groups 72, 73, or 82. So that means that your national occupational classification code would start with 72, 73, or 82. Okay, and this 1 year of work experience has to have been obtained within the last 2 years, and they will count that 2 years from the day that you're submitting the application to Ontario. Okay. Now, one of those occupations, it has to be one identified on your Express Entry profile. So that 1 year of experience needs to be listed on your Express Entry profile for you also to qualify in this category. You need to have at least the intention, again, to reside in Ontario. Now, the next thing is if you're working in a trade that requires licensing or a compulsory trade, you would have to show that you have that required trade certificate to be eligible to apply through this program. Okay, you need to be currently living in Ontario and in possession of a valid work permit. So if you had left Ontario, you're no longer living there, you wouldn't be eligible. Or if your work permit had expired, even if it was recently, you're not eligible. You have to be living in Ontario and your work permit still needs to be valid. Okay, you need to have a language test result in either English or French that is still valid, so done within the last 2 years. And you need to have achieved at least a CLB level 5 on that language test overall to qualify. Okay, you need to have the required amount of settlement funds for your family size. And with this one, you actually do an update is you have to receive a notification of interest before you could go ahead and submit this application. So what's going to happen then is with your Express Entry profile, which is done through your secure IRCC account, they will send you a message saying we've identified your profile and we are interested in it. If you would like to receive a nomination from us or be considered for that nomination, you have X amount of days, it's usually 45, and they will ask you to submit a specific list of documents so they can verify that you meet all of the eligibility criteria. If you do, they will issue you with the provincial nomination. You either need to accept or decline it. If you do accept it, it's going to add 600 points to your comprehensive ranking system score. And then again, your score would be high enough that you would receive your invitation to apply. And then you can be eligible to submit your application for permanent residency. The next program is the Master's Graduate Program. Now, with this application type, it's not always open for application. So you would have to wait for Ontario to release on its news site that it was opening this stream for applications. And once it's open, you don't need any kind of notification of interest. You just go ahead and you submit the application once you meet the criteria. But please note, with these types of applications, when they do open, it's usually full really, really quickly in a matter of hours. So you'd want to have everything prepared so that when it did open, you can just wait in the queue, submit, and hope that you get it in time before they close for the applications. Now, with this one, the first requirement is you have to have completed at least one academic year of full-time study and obtained a master's degree from an eligible university in Ontario. You must not have received any kind of a bursary or a scholarship that required you to return to your home country after graduation. So some countries, they do give out bursaries and scholarships to study abroad, but you're expected once you graduate to return to your home country. If that was the case, you would not be eligible to apply through this program because obviously you would be expected to be going back to your home country. And the next thing with this application is you have to show the intention to reside in Ontario. But obviously, if you're expected to go back to your home country, you wouldn't be able to reside in Ontario. Okay, you have to do an English or a French test, and you have to get at least a CLB level 7 or higher in listening, reading, writing, and speaking, and have those language tests available. They're only valid for 2 years for immigration purposes, so just keep that in mind in case you maybe did the language test as part of your application to university. If it's expired, you would have to do a new one. Okay, you have to have lived in Ontario on valid legal status. So again, you couldn't be out of status living illegally. You have to be on valid status, and you have to have lived in Ontario in 1 year within the last 2 years. And again, they're going to count this from the day you actually submit the application. So count back from that date 2 years, and as long as you've resided in Ontario for 12 months, then you're eligible. Okay. Again, you have to show the required amount of settlement funds for your family size. If you are currently living in Ontario, you have to show you're on legal status. If you're outside of Ontario or outside of Canada, that's fine. You can still apply. You just have to meet all of the other requirements. And you have to be applying under this category within 2 years of your master's degree being issued. So again, the date on the actual degree that was issued to you, that is the date that they're going to count back from. So go back 2 years from that date and just make sure that you are applying within the required timeline. The next category that we are going to be discussing is the PhD graduate stream. Now, with this application stream, you don't have to wait for the government to approach you and identify any kind of profile. As soon as you meet all of the criteria, you would go to the Ontario provincial government website and you would apply directly through the site. So you don't have to wait for what we call a notification of interest, okay? Now, you have to have obtained your PhD from an eligible university in Ontario, and 2 of the years of your PhD studies need to have been completed in Ontario while you were on a valid study permit. So again, you have to have been there on legal status. Obviously, if you weren't on legal status, they wouldn't be able to use that educational experience for this program. Okay, so that's important to note. You have to have lived in Ontario with legal status for at least 1 year within the past 2 years of applying for this application. So again, they're going to count that 2 years from the day you actually click submit. So from that date, they would need to see that at least 12 months were spent living in Ontario on valid status for you to be eligible to apply through this stream. Okay. You have to be able to show that you have the required amount of settlement funds for your family size. You have to have the intention to live in Ontario. And you need to have applied within 2 years of your PhD having been issued. So the date on the actual degree diploma that was issued to you, it would have a date on it. So it's the date on the actual certificate. They're going to count 2 years from that date that you would have had to have submitted this application to be eligible. And if you're still living in Canada or you're physically present in Canada, you have to prove that you have valid legal status to submit this application. And there will be the required application fee as well, which is $1,500 Canadian. The next program that we're going to be discussing is definitely one of the most popular because it does not require a job offer to be eligible. Now, with this one, you do have to wait for what's called the notification of interest to apply. So this is not one of the ones where you could just go to the Ontario government website and apply whenever you felt like it. They would have to first contact you before you could go ahead and submit. So with the human capital priority stream, the first criteria is that you have a valid Express Entry profile, and it would be through that Express Entry profile that they would send you that notification of interest if they identify that they were interested in your profile, okay? You have to, on that Express Entry profile, where it asked you which provinces you are willing to live and work in, you would have either had to have selected all or just specifically ticked off Ontario. And then there would have been a secondary question asking if they could share your information with Ontario. You would have had to have said yes to that question as well for Ontario to be able to consider you through this program. You need to have a valid educational credential assessment that shows that you have at least a bachelor's degree or higher. So where it says Canadian degree equivalency, it needs to say bachelor's degree or anything higher than that. So bachelor's degree plus a 1-year diploma certificate, a master's degree, a PhD. But if it says a 3-year diploma, that won't qualify. It actually has to be a bachelor's degree. So that's just important to note, because when you create your Express Entry profile, on the drop-down menu, the 3-year diploma and the bachelor's degree are on one section. So sometimes people who have a 3-year diploma, the system doesn't know that, and it falsely gives you a notification of interest. And then people go ahead and they submit this full application only to have it refused because they didn't read the fine print that they actually had to have a bachelor's degree and not a diploma to qualify. So even if you get this notification of interest, the onus is always on you, the applicant, to read through the fine print and the manuals to make sure you actually meet all of the criteria before submitting your application. Okay. Now, with your Express Entry profile, you'd have to be classified under either the Federal Skilled Worker category or the Canadian Experience class. In some cases, you might meet the criteria for both, and that's fine. But if you don't meet the criteria for at least one of those programs, then you would not be eligible to be selected through this program. Okay. You need to have the intention to live in Ontario if you're going to go through this program. So if you don't want to live there, then no point in going through this process. You have to have done an English or a French test approved for the application, and it needs to have been done in the last 2 years. And you need to have at least a CLB level 7 in all sections to be eligible to be selected through this program. You would have to have the required amount of settlement funds for your family size. And you would have to have valid immigration status if you are physically in Canada. You can also be eligible for this program if you're not in Canada at the moment, okay? Now, that's the criteria you need to meet just to be considered. Now, the way that they've been selecting people, there's sort of two categories that they have been looking at. One is more related, so it's the tech draws is what they're calling them. And with these, the criteria they look at is twofold. So they have a set list of occupations that they're identifying for these tech draws. And on your Express Entry profile, this would be the occupation code that you had used, would have to be one of these ones listed. Then, after they've implemented that criteria, they then look at people's comprehensive ranking system scores, because obviously they might have too many people who meet the criteria based on work experience, so they then nail it down with the comprehensive ranking system scores. So if we look at the most recent draw, and this is going to vary, so the draws are ongoing throughout the year, so you can always check with Ontario the latest draws, but just to give you an idea of what they're looking for. So the occupations themselves that they're targeting is number one, software engineers and designers, computer programmers and interactive media developers, computer engineers, web designers and developers, database analysts and data administrators, computer and information systems managers. So first, that's the work experience you would have to have in one of those occupation codes. And then they're looking for people with a comprehensive ranking system score between 421 and 451. But again, that score can fluctuate throughout the year depending on how many people are in the Express Entry system. Now, if we look at the selections they've been doing for people not in the tech industry, they again have a set list of occupations that they've been targeting. And it has changed a little bit from draw to draw. So again, this is just most recent. This can change at any time. So even if you're not on the list right now, it doesn't mean you might not be added to it. If you're on it, it also doesn't guarantee that your occupation might not be removed. So just keep that in mind. So they've been looking for financial managers, other administrative service managers, advertising, marketing, and public relations managers, financial auditors and accountants, other financial officers, professional occupations in business management consulting, registered nurses and registered psychiatric nurses, other primary health practitioners, and dietitians and nutritionists. And in the last draw, what they did was they broke it up into two draws. So first you had to be within one of those occupation codes. Then they said, okay, for anybody who has at least the 1 year of work experience in Canada in one of these occupations, will take you if your comprehensive ranking system score is between 358 and 439. If your work experience was obtained outside of Canada, you had to have a score of between 471 and 500. So again, it's quite high, but it will fluctuate up and down throughout the year, just depending on how many people are actually in the Express Entry system. And with this application, once you get your notification of interest, they're going to give you 45 days to submit your full application to Ontario, and you will have to pay the required government application fee, which is $1,500 Canadian. The last program we're going to be looking at is for those people who want to either start a business in Ontario or purchase an existing business in Ontario. So this is not the type of application that somebody would want to make if they're just looking to add points to their Express Entry score. This is just if you are looking at a business opportunity to get into Canada to get your permanent residency. Now, with these type of applications, they do it based on a score-based system. the applicant would have to have either a business plan in mind, or they would have to have identified the business that they would like to purchase or have purchased in Canada. And based on their own personal background and the details of the business, they would be assigned a score, and the province then selects the highest scoring individuals to go ahead with their business plan. So again, you might enter an expression of interest for this program, but there's no guarantee you might be picked depending on what your score is. But the minimum requirements for this program is that you obviously have the intention to run the business in Ontario and be involved into the day-to-day operations. Now, depending where the business is going to be located, you have to have a certain net worth. Now, when we look at this, we divide it in between the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, and then outside of the Greater Toronto Area. So if you want to open a business in the Greater Toronto Area, you have to have a net worth of at least $800,000 Canadian available, and you have to be willing to invest at least $600,000 Canadian into the business. Now, if you're going to be opening the business outside of the Greater Toronto Area, then your personal net worth needs to be $400,000 Canadian, and you need to invest at least $200,000 Canadian. Now, if your business is going to be IT-based, digital communication sector as well, then the limits that apply for people outside of the GTA, that applies to you as well. So if you wanted to open a tech business in the GTA or a digital communications company in the GTA, then you would be subject to the lower net worth and the lower investment amount. So just keep that in mind as well, depending on the type of business that you want to operate or purchase in the province, okay? The next thing is they would want to see that you have a certain amount of business ownership or managerial experience, subject to the type of business you're going to be opening and when you're applying. So you have to have at least 24 months of related work experience owning or operating a business in the last 60 months prior to the submission of your application, okay? Now, depending on where you're going to open the business, if it's in the Greater Toronto Area, you have to create at least 2 full-time jobs for Canadian citizens or permanent residents, and they can't be family members. They would have to be created within 20 months of starting or acquiring the business. And those positions would have to be basically filled for at least 10 months where they're earning the median average wage. If the business is out of the Greater Toronto Area, then it's only 1 position that you would have to create for a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. Okay, so just to keep that in mind as well. If you're going to be purchasing a business instead of starting one from scratch, you would have to do an exploratory visit to Ontario before submitting your expression of interest for this program. And with those exploratory visits, it's going to add points to your application in any case, so it's not a bad idea. Now, these are just the very basics, basic requirements to the program. Based on the type of business you want to operate or purchase, you would then have to really sit down and say, okay, depending where it's going to be based, how many Canadians I want to employ, am I going to have enough points that this is viable? And the type of business that I want to open, is it excluded from this program? Usually it's things that are, more passive investments, something that doesn't require day-to-day operations, but you'd always want to double check before going ahead with any purchases or doing up your business plan. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you want to stay up to date with the latest selections, draws, and Canadian immigration information.